Oh, my watch just
I
turned.
think we can start now.
Now we're 5 seconds late. Okay.
Dang it.
Hi, y'all. You're here at the Writing Horror panel. You are at the right place. This is, I think, a wonderful Venn diagram of interests at the convention, because all of you are likely interested in horror and the Cosmere. We're not going to talk about the Cosmere this morning, but we are going to talk about horror, and we are very glad you're here. We're going to start with introductions because the AI said that that's what we should start with. I'm just kidding. I don't like AI. We're going to start on our right. They're going to tell you about themselves, and then finally, I'll end with myself, and then the panel will be done. Just kidding. Go ahead.
I'm Luke Elliott. I am a writer and a podcaster. So my writing, it spans sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. Mostly short fiction so far. I have a few stories out. One's in Reckoning, one's in Beyond the Vanishing Point anthology, another in the Even Cozier Cosmic anthology that just came out. We can talk about Cozy Cosmic. And I'm also a podcaster. So I have a podcast called Ink to Film. It is about book-to-film adaptations. We've been running that since 2017, weekly episodes. My co-host is a filmmaker, and I'm a writer, so we talk about it from a craft perspective, and we compare and contrast, and at the end of it, we judge whether or not the book or movie was better. And we cover lots of horror on there, so I also have experience of doing that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Steve Diamond. I'm a horror author, fantasy, science fiction guy. I write for Bane, for Aethon, and for anyone who will pay me enough money. And
What's your fee?
It depends. Depends on what the bill is this week. But yeah, I write a lot of horror primarily, and I endeavor to put elements of horror into every other genre that I write.
That's awesome. And what do you like to do for fun?
I smoke brisket, not meth, and listen to a lot of music, build gunpla models.
Ooh.
Sports, big baseball guy.
Looks like a human to me, but that's fine.
Yeah, I do a lot of shooting with one of my buddies.
Cool.
So,
Okay. That was great. And I'm Alex. I'm Alex Bauman. I am a co-host of the Silverlight Guide to the Cosmere podcast. I was asked to moderate this panel. I don't know why, but the moment I was asked, I looked in the mirror and I said, I can go watch a scary movie and I can go read a scary book. And so since then I have only been reading horror, and I have only been having nightmares. And hallucinations. Legitimate ones.
Waking nightmares.
The first thing we're going to do is shout out to my friend Trevor. Raise your hand. Hey, Trevor. He helped us tremendously with this panel. Trevor is the @thesandbox_official on YouTube. He does a lot of great Cosmere content and horror content. When they asked me to do this panel, I thought, I'm going to ask him what he wants to know from horror writers. So he gave us a lot of these questions that I molded into this outline. The flow is going to go like this. We're going to start with the personal experiences of them writing horror. We're going to go to general questions about writing horror, and then we're going to talk about horror in the mainstream. If we have time at the end, we would like to field questions, but we can't promise that we're going to get there. We will end promptly at 10:45 because there is something after us. Before we begin, is there anything else you'd like to say?
Sounds good.
Great. There are many horror subgenres available to readers and writers. Which subgenre were you most attracted to when you started reading? Is that the same one you began your writing career with? And if not, what was that? Steve, we'll start with you.
I've always been any monster type horror. I'm always in. I dig monsters, supernaturally monsters and stuff. And then I always gravitate towards cosmic horror, of course. Anything Lovecraftian, I'm totally in. But I'm much more into the psychological aspect of it, the fear and the dread of horror, rather than what most people think of horror. when you tell them you're a horror author. They get the big saucer eyes and they're like, "Oh no, you like Saw and that's all you do." And I'm like, I actually really like Hitchcock.
Okay.
And so,
do we have any other big Hitchcock fans out there? Yes. My mother met him once on a bus.
and lived.
I didn't say that.
But yeah, I mean, those loves, monsters, psychological, cosmic, I write a lot of that. My novels are in that realm. My short stories are in that realm. I've injected that into the fantasy novels that I've written. Even just the straight up thriller, like regular thrillers with no supernatural elements. I put that kind of stuff in it because horror elements make everything better. It's like bacon.
Agreed. Everybody agree with that? Yeah. Luke,
better.
How about you?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about it. When I was young and still impressionable, I believed in magic and I believed in the supernatural. And I got really into ghost stories. Whenever people would tell me that they had a supernatural encounter or something, I was always very interested. And then I started reading books like Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. You remember those books?
I hated those.
I loved them
so much.
The art in them was particularly fantastic. And I would scare my friends with them. We'd get together and read them. Absolutely love that. And then, I think there was other horror in that realm. It was like for middle grade kind of age. A lot of monster horror. That was, I guess, my introduction to it. But I think as I got older and I became more of a skeptic, I transitioned more into psychological horror and like what could be going on in the mind of an individual where they might be perceiving things like that they consider supernatural. And I like blending those two, right, where it's unclear whether or not what's happening is real. And I think that's a cool kind of ambiguity you can get in psychological horror that I like to play with.
I recently read We Used to Live Here, and that is very much the premise of that book.
Who's that by?
An author.
An author. Okay. I love their work.
I'm not going to take the time to look that up.
Author, A-N.
Thank you for that. Both of you said psychological horror.
Yeah.
Where, outside of books and movies, where do you go for inspiration, and maybe specifically for that psychological horror?
A lot of... So I grew up in a cop family. My dad was a career cop. And I think one of the scariest... I mean, look, anything you write in fiction, none of it's going to be as scary as what the real world can actually throw at you, right? I mentioned that on a panel the other day. I remember when I was younger, I was like 16 or 17, years and years ago. And when you're in a cop family, there are very certain things you fear. And those just prey on your mind, and they just churn in your mind all over and over again. And you worry about them all the time. They just eat at your psyche. And one of those is getting a really late night phone call when your dad is out. And that happened. Got a late night phone call. It was 1 a.m. And my dad was out. And I hear my mom run to the door and go out. And there's this in your brain. Your brain, it just tells you 1,000 times a second, oh, you just lost your dad. Now, everything was okay. He just hurt his knee fighting with an inmate. But that kind of thing, the psychological nature of what that fear is that's constantly in your mind. And then when confronted with the fear, the dread of not knowing what the outcome is going to be, I think that there are experiences like that we all have in some capacity. I mean, if you're a parent, you always have that about your kids, right? And that's, I think those are really good emotions that you've felt. that you can take and put into your fiction to give really good, horrific authenticity to them. So for me, that's where that's what I use for it.
Yeah, I think looking into your own life is the best way to do it. We all experience horrors throughout our lives, and if you haven't yet, just wait. You will.
Hopefully not. Hopefully everything's going to be okay if you haven't yet.
Yeah,
just
sure.
keep swimming.
So for me, I'll get a little confessional too. 2007, I was in a car accident that came out of the blue. I don't remember it. Severe. Flipped my car. Woke up several days later in a hospital and had severe injuries all over my body. I won't go into detail since we're not going to get into gore.
That's true.
But I was unable to get up, and it would be months before I could. And the experience of that, of just like living I was a college student at the time, so living like a college student life and just kind of happily going along, and then having no real barrier between that and transitioning to being in the hospital, because I couldn't remember what happened. And it was everybody just told me what happened after the fact, and I had to believe them. And so that's been a persistent sort of thing that has stuck with me, of like just how fragile it all can be.
Certainly, yeah.
Well, and that's a pretty common horror trope, actually.
Yeah.
You know, that's a common fear that people have is, loss of control, loss of memory.
Yeah.
I mean, those are huge. And so, yeah, totally get it.
We're going to jump a few questions here. Not that you're looking at the questions, but I am. We're going to continue with this. Yeah. So you're relating these personal experiences from the past. How do you face those things? And how do you even more go into characters that are doing sick, twisted, horrible things, or creatures or scenarios that are really horrible? How do you deal with those without it, corrupting what's in your mind? Okay, wrong question. Just kidding.
As we both giggle.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it's therapeutic in a way.
Okay.
And I look at it that way. Like it's once I put something into form on the page and write about it, in some ways it loses some of its power over me. So I don't know. I don't feel like I have that directionality where it's corrupting me. It's more that I'm kind of getting it out of myself and putting it on a page and understanding it in a way that it maybe doesn't make sense when it's just in my mind. If that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. How about you, Steve?
I have an absolute blast and a ball.
It is fun.
Writing the horrific stuff. I love psychologically torturing my characters. I love physically torturing my characters. I love writing monsters that are doing crazy, incredible things. I co-wrote this fantasy novel with my buddy Larry Correa, and it's a fantasy novel, but it is a horror novel. And one of the characters that I was primarily responsible for in the novel is a horrible, horrible person. He would be the villain in any other novel, but there's someone worse. And that's what he does. He goes around, he tortures people, he kills people, and he has a smile on his face the whole time he does it. He's like Christoph Waltz in the opening scene of Inglourious Basterds. Yeah, that's what he is. I love writing characters like that because as dark as a character is, that contrast against a character who is good makes the good character better and the bad character darker. And so I have an absolute ball writing that stuff. And anytime you read anything of mine and there's all this violence on the screen, understand that I am laughing the entire time I'm writing it.
That's good. That's creepy. So talking more about that then, so you juxtapose good and evil. But of course, any fantasy story will likely have good and evil. What then makes horror for you specifically? What is the line in your mind that crosses from just general into horror?
For me, it's a dial.
Okay.
So one of the things that, that Dan Wells and I talk about all the time on panels like this is we consider there to be kind of sort of 3 building blocks to horror.
Okay.
Fear, dread, and then shock. Now, those 3 things by themselves, they're just 3 building blocks that you can use in any story that you want to write. I mean, I'm assuming most of you want to be, or want to be writers and authors. Does that seem like a fair thing? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So, fear, dread, and shock. Fear being, I'm scared of that thing. Dread being, I'm confronted with the possibility of this thing being right here. And the terror that induces in me with the imminence of it. And then shock being, I just got slapped upside the face with being confronted with that fear. Right? And so all of those things, how much you dial up the knob from 1 to 11 on it is going to kind of decide and push you into horror, like horror, versus this is a smaller element of horror that I'm using in my sci-fi story or fantasy story or cozy romance or whatever, right? In a cozy romance, it's like dialed to a 2, and it's I fear that I'm never gonna be accepted by this. I'm a big city girl who moved to the countryside, and I'll never know if this lumberjack in a plaid shirt is gonna love me. Like, that's like a 1 or a 2, right?
This is 0.5.
Right? Whereas Alien, I'm worried about this thing wrapping around my face and then impregnating me with a weird thing that's going to rip out of my chest and then go devour everybody on the ship. That's a 10. Right?
Probably 11. Alien Romulus.
The thing is the 11.
Okay. That's fair.
And so, like, it's a dial. And so you can tune it however you like. If you're writing horror, like horror, you can dial that as high as you want, and you're totally fine.
Okay. Luke?
It's interesting because I think the question is, are we talking about horror as a genre or horror as an emotion, a feeling that is evoked by literature, right? So the feeling can exist in a lot of different kinds of literature, and if it becomes the prevailing feeling, those sort of, like you said, fear, those kind of emotions, if those prevail in the thing you're reading, you might call it horror as its like main genre. But of course, you can have touches of it. And this is all highly subjective. Much like romance, some people might call something a romance, but other people might disagree depending on how prevalent the romance is in the story. And I think of horror as the same way, and you get into a lot of discussions with people about whether or not something is truly horror. But then, of course, there are things we all agree are horror, like Alien, I would say. But, of course, it's also sci-fi, right? So when you're talking genres, things occupy multiple spaces.
Genre is just marketing.
Right. Genre is marketing. That's where they put it in the bookstore. Yep. You mentioned you had the 3 building blocks. How can you dial those without it feeling forced? Let's get into more of the technical things of writing horror for those wannabe authors out there. I can't wait to read their works.
Without it feeling forced. The subtlety is a skill you have to learn in all writing. You don't want anything to feel forced that you're writing. You don't want any element. So it's all about making sure it feels organic. It's earned. The artifice of it isn't, obvious to the reader. And then I think you can get away with anything, especially if someone picks up a story knowing it's horror. They're expecting certain elements to be present, so they're not going to be surprised when there's a little bit of gore, right? If you're picking up a horror piece, you probably expect that, unless maybe it's middle grade or something.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I like to, if the main thrust of the story that I'm writing is horror, then I make sure that it is integrated into the world and into the characters. So think about if you're writing fantasy or science fiction or whatever, right? We'll use science fiction for an example. Science fiction technology is really important in it, right? I think that's pretty fair. Depending on if it's a space opera versus a hard sci-fi, there are certain things you're doing within it, and you're building your characters that way. So I always come to stories with a character in mind first. And one of the very first things I do is, okay, what do they love? What do they need? What are they good at? Yada, yada. And for horror, I specifically tailor in what do they fear. And then I will tailor monsters to riff off of that fear. And I will tailor the world to provide as many instances as possible for the characters to be put in opposition to what they fear. Sometimes to overcome it, and sometimes to be overcome by it. And, it's just a different type of currency. It's a different type of economics that you're using within your story. You're just using fear as a currency rather than, anything else, rather than romance or actual money or whatever.
I want to provide an alternate method of writing, just because I heard this a lot when I was starting out from writers, that they start with a character. And
You don't have to. That's just how I do it.
Well,
Yeah.
it's so common that I started to feel like, well, I'm doing it wrong.
Oh, no.
Because that's not how I tend to write. I would tend to come up with some sort of concept or speculative idea, and I would have no characters attached to it, but I'd want to explore it. And so you can absolutely start that way and then build character out of it. You kind of
100%.
reverse engineer what he was talking about.
Yeah, 100%.
Who would be afraid of this?
100%.
Who would be the most interesting person to read about encountering this situation that I've come up with? And you can reverse engineer it that way as well.
Yeah, 100%.
Clever. Would you say, would your advice be for those who want to be published, go really hard and then dial it back, or go soft and then dial it up if the agent or publishing company wants?
I don't care what they think. Frankly, I don't.
First.
I'm not writing it for them.
Yeah.
I'm writing it for me.
Okay.
I personally find it easier to go way far and then pull it back until people stop looking at me like I'm going to kill them.
I appreciate that.
So my day job is I'm an accountant. And I'm a pricing analyst for the government, which is why I write horror. And so we're always creating budgets, right? I know that your eyes are glazing over. You're like, oh crap, Steve's talking about money and accounting.
No, please continue. I know Trevor's actually into this.
So so you're creating these budgets, and I'm always dealing with people who are. They're always trying to push the boundaries or whatever. I always find it easier to start up here and then start talking them down little by little as I can, than to start down here and then have things get kind of messed up or try to come up to where they want to be in terms of budgets. It's the same thing in horror. People are far more tolerant of horror than they will let you believe. Think about like the show Stranger Things, from where it started in season 1 to what the violence level was and stuff, to season 4, which is straight up Nightmare on Elm Street and Carrie. Think about the journey that they've slowly brought you on to where you will tolerate that in season 4 and be like, yeah, that was dope.
That makes a good point. I want to continue with the movies and shows.
Well, can I weigh in on that question?
You sure can.
So I think when we're talking about going too far, it's interesting because I think horror always has a transgressive element to it, transgressing on people's comfortable positions in life and what they find acceptable. And that might be through gore, that might be through psychological situations, that might be through body horror, or putting a character in a situation that a sane person would not want to be in. And so I think it comes down to the writer and what you're trying to convey. Because a lot of people write horror, I think, because they've experienced something in their lives and they want to share that experience with a reader in some way. And so I think the transgressiveness of horror can be a powerful tool, and you just have to decide for yourself how far do I want to push the reader in order to get the response that I want from them. And then later you can sort of try and find a market that is willing to accept it, because there are markets that will accept just about anything. You just have to find them, and then that becomes more of a marketing issue.
Thing,
but yeah, I think when you're creating, it's focusing more on what is the purpose of the transgression that I'm putting on the page. Not just because I want to make someone grossed out, but what is the real reason I'm doing this, and then just be true to that, and I think you'll be fine.
That makes sense. With what you just said, grossed out, and with what Steve was talking about with movies and shows, a lot of movies and shows rely heavily, maybe too heavily, on the shock factor, 100%. Right? It's boring. It gets really, really boring. Does anybody else think that, or am I alone?
It really does.
Yeah. I would much rather have actual horror, which you explained earlier as the 3 building blocks. Shock does play a role in that. Mm-hmm. How can aspiring authors steer away from just relying on a shock factor and actually getting into horror?
Yeah, I think shock is fairly easy, and that's what we tend to react to, especially in film. You can play a loud sound unexpectedly, mm-hmm. and people will jump. You can flash something unexpectedly, and people will jump.
I do every time.
It's because that's built into our physiology.
Mm-hmm.
It's just going to happen, and it feels cheap when it happens, and you feel kind of cheated. But there are moments that can evoke a similar response that still feel earned and organic.
Like The Conjuring 2.
Sure.
Just saying.
And one of the things that I try and remember on our podcast, because we cover all kinds of stories, all kinds of movies, is that there is an audience for every one of these, and I try and remember that there are people who love every one of these, even if I don't like them. And just because I don't like something doesn't mean it's not good. It's all just subjective in art anyway. So some people like that feeling, and they seek it out.
I'm sorry if that's you.
I tend to agree that I like more psychological, quieter horror that's more sort of pensive, slower paced, atmospheric. Some people find that boring, and I can't tell them they're wrong. Some people, the Saw franchise clearly has fans, right?
I'm actually a fan of the Saw franchise.
There you go. So to each their own is kind of how I feel about it. But yeah,
I like them for their plot.
Yeah. There you go.
I'm not lying. I'm so sorry.
The first one's pretty good.
The latest one was pretty good too.
I haven't seen that one.
Legitimately, I would watch it maybe 2 or 3 more times.
Watch it for the plot.
I'm not saying it's good. No, actually, it was good.
Yeah, I don't even remember what the question was.
Cheap scares. How to make them earned.
Yeah, I think a lot of that just comes to technique and practice.
Okay. Practice.
Any of this, whether we're talking about horror, action, romance, magic, whatever you want to call it, anything, being able to do it well, the largest thing is it comes to practice. So, we've all seen the Michael Bay films, right? Mm-hmm. Where it's explosion, 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 explosion. And by the end of it, you're like, man, I'm so bored with explosions for some reason. And that's because in anything, you can't just be up here the whole time with your pace or your tension or whatever.
Just like Red Rising.
It has to cycle down. It has to cycle up and down. Okay? Red Rising does this. It cycles up and down.
No.
Ish.
The first one does. The rest of them just keep going up, and I hated it. I didn't finish it because of that.
It depends on what you consider your valleys and your peaks as it comes to the storytelling beats, right? But the reason you get bored with Michael Bay, the reason you get bored with cheap scares, in films is because it's just this the whole time, and like you said, it's not earned. So think of, have a lot of people here seen the movie The Thing?
Yeah, love it.
Okay. That is a movie that starts not with fear or dread, it starts with shock. Okay? And most people wouldn't lead with that, but Carpenter did in that film because
what scene are you referring to?
The dog that... Wow.
Okay, I mean, that's not the very start, but yeah.
It's basically
pretty
the start.
I mean, you see the dog creeping around.
Yeah, I mean, okay.
There's some build-
opening scene, dog being chased, is being shot at, and your first response, it's not fear or dread, you're just going, well, that's weird. Huh. Okay, I mean, better not kill the dog. We know what happens if you kill the dog. John Wick shows up. But, it leads with the shock. And then from there, the distrust happens. The dread happens. And then they punctuate it, an exclamation point, with more shock that subverts and changes what you thought you knew about the creature, the thing. And that happens probably a dozen times through the movie. And so when the head falls off the table, it turns into a crab and it walks away, and the characters are like, "What the?" Like you as the viewer have the exact same reaction as the characters, because that is
a movie that goes to all the extremes and yet earns it,
and it earns it the whole time. And so technique-wise, kind of what we've been talking about here, and that's making sure that these story beats feel earned and that they're integrated into the story.
So, as a writer, trying to plan out your story, and you're sort of like, something scary hasn't happened yet. It's easy to say, well, now a monster shows up, or now something blows up, or now someone jumps out of a closet and stabs. And I think when you're first starting out writing horror, you start to feel pressure to have something scary occur, and so you can be tempted to throw in things like that. But I think fear is usually built through anticipation, and so you can use other techniques, and you can use literary techniques to foreshadow, to use, you don't want to get into pathetic fallacy, but you can use environment, you can use setting, you can use tone to imply something foreboding is happening. And we've all seen movies or read stories where you just feel like something is wrong, even though nothing has happened yet. And that's a lot harder to do. And I would recommend reading your favorites and trying to see how they're doing it. Like, pay attention to their word choice, pay attention to what techniques they're employing. And it's the fact that it's harder usually means it's more rewarding. So
correct.
I'll say, if you want a really good example of this, I picked up Steve's book Residue in preparation for this, and I intended to read all of it, and I didn't. I got to chapter 4, but he does this exact thing in the first few chapters. Everything he's talking about legitimately is in those first few chapters, so go pick up his book.
It's almost like I did it on purpose.
Yeah. That's great. You mentioned monsters. Let's go mainstream.
Yes.
What...
I love monsters.
Which monsters or evil people do you find the most entertaining to read and or write? Think about it for a moment.
I mean, it really depends on my mood.
Okay.
When it's Halloween, and I love watching werewolf movies.
Oh, okay.
Dog Soldiers is one of my favorite movies of all time.
Dog Soldiers.
I think it came out in 1992. It's a story about a military group in a military unit that's out doing training exercises, and they get confronted with werewolves. And it was in 1992, so the film, it's all practical effects, so it looks fantastic.
Wild movie.
It's fantastic.
It's very fun.
It's so good. And the really cool thing about it is you get all these awesome monsters. They are just violent. They're a very kind of, like a more spindly version of a werewolf. They're a little bit taller and spindlier, so they kind of have an almost alien quality to them. But what's really neat is the characters are competent. These guys know what they're doing, except they're facing werewolves, and it doesn't matter. And so seeing the camaraderie that they have, and then the creativity that they employ to try to get through the situation is most of the fun of the film. And I say fun on purpose because monster films are fun to me, especially good ones. It really depends on my mood, though.
Sure.
I don't know about you. Does it change for you depending on kind of where you're at?
I love horror in all its forms, and I think it depends on what I'm seeking out. If I had to pick a favorite, though, I mentioned earlier, ambiguity is something that I do like to seek out, and I like. I'll try not to spoil anything, but I mean, I like movies and books where the entity or even what happened at the end, you're unclear even to yourself. Is what the character perceived as real, what actually occurred, or was something going on in the mind, or something else going on? Paul Tremblay is a favorite of mine, and we had him on the podcast to talk about Knock at the Cabin. And he is a master of this kind of storytelling. Robert Eggers' film The Witch is a favorite of mine. Talk about a slow burn psychological movie. That I just was taken with the historical accuracy and so many other things, storytelling elements that went into that story that made it work. Those are the ones that I'm drawn to. Again, I know that people find them slow and some people find them boring. Sure. But that's what I like.
And there are those times where that's what I want to see.
Yeah.
So there's a couple TV shows that came out that I enjoyed that were far more slow burn. Any of the Flanagan TV shows kind of have the more slow burn, right?
House on Haunted Hill.
Haunting Hill House, and then Midnight Mass.
Awesome.
I really like those. Or Archive 81, I really enjoyed.
Oh yeah. So we covered both of those.
Yeah, that's very much like cosmic-y.
Yeah,
kind of
because that's based on a podcast. If anyone didn't know.
Yeah,
it's a really interesting one. Yeah.
And so, and that's the great thing about horror is that you can come at it from so many different angles and so many different flavors. And then depending on where your mood or whatever, if you're interested in the more slow burn, like clutch the blanket against your chest sort of a thing, you can get that. If you want I want to eat some popcorn and watch this thing kill everything, you can have that. And I think that's the beauty of it. And especially when you start taking those things and integrating them into other genres and stuff, you get rewarded for that as well. That's why I adore it.
And I'll mention one of my absolute favorite pairings is sci-fi and horror.
100%.
And especially when that gets into the cosmic realm. And for me, my favorite elements of cosmic are just sort of the immensity and unknowable nature of the universe, our real universe. Is manifested in some way, and our characters are confronted with it in some way. And I would argue even a film like 2001: A Space Odyssey deals with cosmic horror, and I love those elements of it. And on the other end of the spectrum, Event Horizon is a favorite of mine, even though not perfect movie, but I still just love that movie because it is
nice,
so wild.
I just read Ghost Station by S.A. Barnes. That's very sci-fi, cosmic horror. It's wonderful.
Love that.
Well, and then conversely, using the exact same themes that you were just talking about, Western horror, as in like the Old West, because they are dealing with, especially if you set it within the time frame, it deals with the same thing, the unknown, things out there that are beyond your comprehension. You're isolated from help or from resources, and so they tend to prey a lot on the same basic structures of fear.
Do you have a good example of that?
Cowboys versus Aliens.
No. Bone Tomahawk does a little bit of this. But in fiction, you can there's a whole Weird West genre that deals with this. One of my favorites is Joe Lansdale. He everything he writes is awesome. But he has a series that's called Dead Man's Road. And it's about a reverend who goes around killing monsters in the Old West, but there's so much unknown with it.
Badass.
He's a very Old Testament reverend.
That's really cool.
It's fantastic.
We've got about 5 minutes left. We will field a question or two. If anybody would like to ask public. I saw your hand, and then we'll go to the lady over here. Yes.
Yeah, I was curious about, as far as horror goes, one of my favorite things is the fear of the unknown. But as an author, you almost feel, you feel the same curiosity as the reader to know what that unknown is. As an author, how do you balance the fear of the unknown, of like an unknown monster or entity, with revealing and satisfying that hunger for knowledge without ruining the fear that came with the unknown in the first place?
So you want to have the fear, but then have it feel good at the end for the reader, potentially. How do you do that? Fear the unknown to the known, potentially.
I like to think about the movie Jaws as just like a prime example of withholding information. And think about how little you actually see the shark. And so that's the case. Like if you know a lot about it, the more you can withhold that information, the longer it can grow in the mind of the reader, because as soon as you reveal it, it's always a little bit less frightening, because all of a sudden we can put a name to it. We can say, oh, it's just a shark. But before that, it's an elemental monster of unknown size and ferocity, right? So yeah, I think it's just about making sure you're patient. You don't want the reader to become frustrated with you. But yeah, make sure you don't reveal too early.
Well, in just like anything, like say you're writing historical fiction, in general you do a ton of research on it and you know all the things, but you do not put all of that into the story. Just because you know everything about the monster does not mean your characters know everything about the monster. And so that's when point of view becomes very important within your story. You're showing, you're revealing the creature, the monster, the terror, whatever, piece by piece through their eyes, through the most interesting point of view's eyes. And so you as the author, you get to decide how that happens and kind of parse it out like Luke was saying.
Nice. And then we had one more question over here.
So whether people agree or disagree, the mainstream media deems Stephen King to be the master of horror writing. Who do you guys believe to be the next generation's master of horror?
Who is the next generation master of horror?
Oh, that's not right. I thought you were just going to ask me who I thought was the best.
I mean, I did mention Paul Tremblay earlier.
He's really good.
He is really good and friends with Stephen King. But I would say next generation.
Stephen Graham Jones is pretty up there usually.
Stephen Graham Jones, yes.
But see, my answer to this will always be Robert McCammon. Robert McCammon, to me, is the best horror author who's ever lived. And still lives. He's not dead.
Okay. One more question. I saw your hand.
So I can watch John Carpenter's The Thing and it doesn't touch me, but all the Alien movies really freak me out. What's something that kind of is at the edge of what you can stand in terms of books or movies?
As in, it's too frightening?
Just frightening enough that it shakes you up, but you can watch or read everything.
What's something that's right at the very edge of being too frightening for these guys? Okay, I'll go first. If you cut a muscle,
I don't like eyeballs.
yeah, we won't go too gore, but that got me recently, actually.
For me, that line just keeps getting pushed out. And look, I'll be totally honest with you. It really depends on how good the special effects are.
I think,
which is weird.
If you really get into horror, you start seeking that line. Because I'm realizing that that's where I'm drawn. I want it to push me to the very edge of what I can stand. Junji Ito is an artist whose art is...
Junji Ito fans?
It's really good.
If you're not, go find him.
We just covered Uzumaki on the podcast. The first episode is great. The rest, not so much.
They're still worth it.
Yeah, maybe. But the manga itself is fantastic. And his art in particular is one that I know viscerally makes me almost sick. and psychologically the same. But I find that I am drawn to it, and whenever I see his work on a shelf, I like want to pick it up and flip through it, even though I'm scared to do it.
And Berserk has a little bit of that too.
Yeah. I love his stuff.
15 seconds left. Thank you all so much for coming to this panel.
Thank you, guys.
If you enjoyed, please give the authors a round of applause. Okay, it does seem like they enjoyed it. Good job, guys.
If you want to come see us really quick, I'm in booth 412 and you're like 417.
Yeah, 417. And if you like hearing me talk about art, check out my podcast, Ink to Film. I talk about adaptations weekly.
And if you need a palette cleanser, I'm at 225 with really cute stickers.
Thank you all.
Attention, world hoppers. Attention, world hoppers. If you need a stamp, please line up in an organized fashion. We cannot give stamps in the Silverlight Mercantile for the rooms. If at all possible, it's holding up the lines. We have people out there ready to stamp for you. If you are blessed with a lovely Edge Dancer sticker, you need only to raise your passport and someone will come stamp you. Thank you.
Give me sunglasses.
Wow, yeah. Oh, and now the mics are live. That's horrifying. Okay, somebody got it. A couple people. Thank you. We got 8 minutes.
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, and we got everybody's out by 10:45. So it's a
Yeah.
hard cutoff.
Luke Elliott?
Oop,
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Alexander?
Me. I'll take a second one.
This one is not as fancy.
It's still cool.
Okay.
Because it says my name.
There, you got it. And
That's
There
me.
you go.
Thank you so much.
I have two because I'm the only non-writer up here. Oh no. I'm here to be funny. It's not an oh no. I promise.
Oh man.
I have a throat lozenge.
Do you really?
I do.
That'd be awesome.
I got it from Dan Wells' booth.
Oh, good. Then I know it's tainted the right way.
I kept it nice and warm for you.
Sweet.
Oh, you're supposed to say Ricola before you. No? Okay.
No, I was too busy shoving it in my face.
I'll do it for you. Ricola.
When you're in a booth, you don't understand. You always forget how loud the convention halls are. And when you're talking to everybody that's coming by, you're yelling the whole time.
Yes.
And so, yeah, my voice is just about dead. And of course, our air is poison here, so.
I've noticed that.
Yeah. It's awesome.
That's also horrifying.
Yeah, sometimes we have the worst air in the world, literally.
Literally?
Yeah, it's great.
Ranked?
Oh,
Wow.
yeah. Yeah, we beat China. We smoke them. No pun intended. I'm here all week.
Do we have? Okay. If we do have time for audience questions, we'll just have them yell it, and I'll repeat it to the. Potentially, sure. Oh yes, that would be wonderful, Squire. What is your name, Squire?
Kate.
Squire Kate, thank you. Stonewood Squire Kate, thank you. Did y'all think about answers to the questions beforehand, or is it?
No.
Cool.
I forgot
So,
to look at the questions.
So I'm supposed to look at
okay,
I mean, I looked at them, but I forgot what they are.
okay.
So it's going to be fresh.
It is fresh. That's what they're here for. I really enjoy psychological horror.
Yeah.
But a lot of it is kind of, it's outside my realm of being able to understand how it could even be like possible, when it's like blurring the lines between paranormal and reality. But when I stayed up late Thursday night reading Wind and Truth, and I don't know what time I got to, I was legitimately hallucinating people coming up to the booth asking me for a stamp. And I was laying in bed in the hotel. And I'd be like, hey, my name's Mark. In my head, I'd hear, hey, my name's Mark. Can I get a stamp? And I'd be like, where? Hold on. I'm reading about, where's the stamp? No. You're a hallucination. Go away. 5 separate times. And I was like, it's time to put the book down and go to sleep.
Was it always Mark?
No, it actually changed. There were different people, 5 separate people.
I turned 40 over here.
Great. I'll try to look that way. That'd be
great.
Really wonderful. I'll also be looking at every second tick off on my watch.
Yeah.
It's actually kind of relaxing. Just a little tick, tick, tick.
Man, if I do that, I'll go to sleep.
Tick, 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 tick.
That's how we're going to make the panel enjoyable. Yeah.
It's funny.
We can probably start whenever.
Yeah. I don't want people to miss out on who we are, though. We'll give them a few more minutes.
A couple minutes to
Yeah, we can entertain in other
What time is
ways.
It's an early 56.
I could
Oh, yeah, we got time.
I can whistle pretty well.
Whistle.
You asked for it.
Have you been collecting the card?
I have not.
Well, you see, when you have a stamp, you don't get to collect cards. You get to give away stamps, which is fulfilling, but not in the same way.
I've left
That's
my
true.
booth twice.
Wow. Is this the second?
This is the third time
Okay.
now.
Okay.
Yeah.
There, 3 times.
Yeah.
So I got my book signed by you this morning.
Right.
And I bought I'm Not a Serial Killer.
Oh, good.
I intended to read that before this panel. I did not, but I did get it signed by Dan Wells. And I did get to tell him reading Hollow City got me through my first appendix surgery.
I'm a character in that book.
Are you really?
Yeah.
There you go. Somebody caught it. I did have 2 appendix surgeries. Talk about horrifying.
I only had one.
I did not, unfortunately. Not that I'm aware of. See, we can't go. There's a hard stop on going into gore. But what I will say is that if a little, what is the fancy name for a little like stone?
Like a gallstone or kidney stone?
It's like a gallstone, but it was in my appendix for like 9 to 12 months, hardening, like causing inflammation, hardening the appendix into something they call a phlegmon, which I assume is French, like mayonnaise. And so I had eaten some biscuits and gravy that morning, and my doctor called and said, hey, you need to go to the emergency room right now because your appendix has issues. And I go there, and we get through the surgery, and then I wake up, and my wife tells me they couldn't take your appendix out because it had hardened and attached itself to my abdominal wall. So, yeah.
It's a good example of body horror.
It is a good example of body horror. There was a point to this.
Not in a cool way, though.
No. But then after 6 weeks of really heavy-duty antibiotics, it loosened up and they were able to take it out the normal way.
Huh.
Yeah.
That's weird.
So what I'm saying is Hollow City was a good book. If you haven't read it, it's very good.
Bonus, if you read it, I play a crazy dude in it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.